What's up, guys? So I'm going to talk about the affirmation trap. This is Governor's Off number 2. So affirmation is a really strong quality. It's something that people really desire to have. There's many things that people look for when they're putting out work, when they're trying to be successful in some area or another. But I feel like that affirmation is actually the strongest one of these qualities that people really look for and they really want. And it's a trap in a way. So I want to get into what's called the affirmation trap. So for instance, when you compare affirmation as a quality to other things, like people want validation, and that's a pretty strong thing, you know, people want to be validated. You want credibility. Credibility is pretty powerful too. What makes affirmation even stronger than both these qualities is affirmation, if you even look at the specific definition of it, which I did in order to kind of, you know, even get better context for this, is affirmation is basically something that's stated as a fact. It's something that's asserted strongly and publicly. So when you have validation or credibility, those things are pretty strong, but they're not necessarily, let's say, universal, or they're not stated as a fact. So you could have credibility, you could have validation, but those are almost things that are attached to things that are outside of you or outside of, in some ways, what you're doing. Like, they can be a bit more fluid, but affirmation, it's just reality. When you get affirmation, you don't even question things like validation or credibility anymore. So that's why people really want affirmation. You know, and basically too, affirmation, it offers you a feeling of establishment, of, you know, like I said, status, and those other qualities like I mentioned initially, like credibility. So when you're looking to get success, you really want it, but it's a trap. So let's get into that a bit. So first of all, what are some of the drawbacks of affirmation? So one of the first drawbacks of affirmation is that it comes late. So you can kind of already, you know, have acquired skills, you can kind of produce work, and you'll almost get affirmation at a certain point when you almost no longer need it. It's almost something that comes after you've already done all the steps, after you've already shown all the work, after you've already proven yourself and to others that you're capable and you're, you know, worthwhile, whatever you're trying to prove when you're trying to be successful in your area or your industry. Another thing about it is affirmation, people really desire affirmation just to even keep motivated. So if you aren't getting positive affirmation from people, your motivation just drops a bit, because you don't really get that feedback, and you really want it, man. You really just want to have that quality attributed to you, or that innate feeling of it. And again, people use affirmation as validation, and they use it as confirmation that they're on the right track. So these are 3 drawbacks that you can kind of see about it. Like, it's something that is not even relevant to what you're necessarily doing, but because you're so focused on it, because you desire it, because you need it to motivate you, it's basically hindering you almost more than it's helping you. And by the time that you finally get it, you're not even really needing it, because it takes you so much longer than you actually should. It takes a lot longer than it should take to get it. So that's just the first point about the drawbacks of it in general. Alright, so another point on affirmation is that things that you get from it, like credibility, that sort of stuff should actually come from within. You don't really want to have someone else or some other influence that assigns that to you. Because, for instance, to actually get credibility, you need to actually put out evidence of what you're doing, right? You need to convince individuals, and then to actually convince individuals, the problem is you need to actually convince groups of people. So for one person who knows you well, or even just a stranger, they might not actually believe in you or give you credibility until you've convinced a group of people. And sometimes to convince a group of people, you need to convince, a whole industry of people, or you need to even convince greater society. So that's part of the reason why it comes late, is you have to convince all these people, you have to give out all this evidence of what you're doing to finally get even that little bit of affirmation. So, since like the most truest form of affirmation, the greatest statement of fact that you're, doing right, you're on the right track, let's say, it comes from actually convincing the world. So that's why it would come so late. You see people who have really made it, who are super confident, who are super sure of themselves, and the way they got there is they had to convince everybody before they actually felt it themselves. So how do you remove this artificial barrier of affirmation? Well, what you first got to understand is affirmation, it requires self-awareness, it requires confidence, and it requires a vision. You need those three things in order to actually overcome affirmation, or to actually eventually get it. Because if you lack any of those three, you're going to be misdirected. So, for instance, self-awareness. If you just think that you're on the right track, if you believe that, okay, you're doing what is necessary, but you don't have a good awareness of actually how you come across, let's say the quality of your work you're producing, all that stuff, then having confidence in a vision doesn't really mean much, or it doesn't mean it's not enough. Confidence, that's a big one. Like I said, if affirmation, it basically gives you validation and credibility. So to overcome that, you need to just be confident that you are doing well, and that you're, on the right track, or that you have the right skill set, whatever it is that you're improving. That's a big one. Next is you actually need a vision. So you can be really self-aware, you can be really self-confident, but if you don't actually even, have a good grasp of where you're going with any of this, then at some point you can't really picture the route that'll eventually get you there. So you need to have a bit of a vision, because when you actually have a vision too, you can kind of relay that to other people, and they can kind of latch onto your vision, get a good understanding as well, and they can help follow along with where you're going and give you that sort of traction as you go, because you're explaining things as it's happening in reality. So again, I want to talk about though too, why though is affirmation then so tempting? You need those three qualities to overcome it in some ways, but why is it just so tempting? So basically, people want affirmation because once you get affirmation, once it's publicly stated as a fact that you're, doing well, that you are correct, that you're successful, whatever it is, it makes things a lot easier. So one obvious example is people who are really successful, even sometimes after they, haven't produced a hit in a while, or they haven't, they're not prolific anymore, they can return to an industry, they can return to a group of people who previously knew what they were capable of. And not only that, they just all of a sudden can get right back into it. So once you have affirmation, there's a larger pool of people that you can select from to work with and collaborate with. And you can also collaborate with other people who have reached that affirmation level too. Because you're all in the same boat now, right? You're all one, you've all made it. But you have to make it to actually get to that point where it's easier. So obviously it's a little bit complicated to actually get there. Another thing, once you've got affirmation, it's a lot easier to get exposure. So again, other people see that you've gotten it, they see that you've made it, and they want to collaborate you. They want to put you on the cover of what they're doing, whether it's an article, they want to put you as a thumbnail, they want to say featuring this guest. it makes things just so much easier because people then want to associate with someone who's basically affirmed themselves. Again, people also really desire it because it's a confidence boost. You don't need motivation as much once you've already affirmed yourself that you've made it. You don't think you're going crazy because you're like, look, I have all this track record and I've obviously proven that I can do this. So you're not questioning yourself every step of the way. You know you're on the right track because you've already done it. You've already got that success. You've already gotten affirmation. And finally, another reason that it's tempting is you can have like those 3 qualities I mentioned earlier. You can have self-awareness, you can have confidence, you can have a vision. But eventually, if you don't have affirmation, a lot of people, they start to burn out. So it just becomes that much more tiring, right? You don't have that motivation, that little bit of energy that you get from affirmation that people will give you. So it's a trap for different reasons. When you don't get affirmation, you start to mimic other people because you start to see what other people have done in order to try and attain what they've done, what they've gotten. So in some cases that can work out. Other cases you're just mimicking some other people and you're not even making yourself any different than anyone else, and you're falling into an area that's basically, let's say, really saturated. There's a lot of people who are already doing that sort of thing, and now you're trying to break in by mimicking them, not even bringing anything new to the table. So without affirmation, when you start putting out work and you're not getting it, at least not getting it quickly, or let's say at all, you start to worry that you're even being forgotten. You worry that like so much that people aren't even paying attention to you, so you just start putting out stuff and you're maintaining like a lower standard of what you could be doing. You're not trying to progress anymore. You just don't want to be forgotten anymore because maybe you've gotten some attention. And you know, attention and some credibility and some validation, they can be what you need on your path to getting affirmation ultimately, right? But sometimes when people get a crowd of following of any kind, let's say they get a few people that really are latched on to what they do, they just want to maintain that low threshold without even considering a future audience or anything like that. They want to basically have this low barrier that they want to maintain, and that becomes more of a focus to them. It's just not to be even forgotten about what they're doing. They want to keep posting every day. Let's say if they're doing content, they want to say, they don't want to make anything better. They just want to keep the ball rolling every day. They just don't want it to seem like they've given up, I guess. Let's say that. All right, so one more drawback of affirmation is when you don't have it, you just begin to envy the resources of other people. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying, where when you have affirmation, it makes it easier for you to collaborate with other people. And sometimes when you be able to collaborate with other people, they have those resources and stuff, and you just start to envy them. Obviously that can be an obstacle. And sometimes even just maintaining where you're at, not even, say you aren't even able to improve, but you're at a point where all you can do is maintain, it can really start to hurt your ego if you just aren't getting affirmation because you just don't feel like you're progressing. You think, like I said, affirmation is so far away from, it takes so long to get there that it just starts to hurt your ego because you don't know what you're doing wrong. You just question yourself that much more. It takes up a bit more resources. It's one of the biggest traps, as you can see, from all these reasons. So here's another thing that's an issue, is that if you just want to maintain and you're not even trying to focus on progressing at a certain point, because again, you're just so drained from not getting affirmation. The other issue is that your audience, actually, that you've initially attracted, so you had an audience that was actually, they saw potential in you, right? They think, or you have a customer base, whatever your industry you're in. They realize that you're just starting out. At least, a good amount of them do. they kind of know your limitations. But the problem is, when you're just maintaining what you're doing, when you're not progressing, because you're not getting affirmation, they slowly start to drop off. So say you had 100 fans each video that you put out. I'm relating a lot of things to what I'm doing because it's the easiest example I can kind of do. And let's be honest, I guess a lot of people want to be content creators, and so I think this is kind of a relevant thing to stick with. So say you're putting out something and all you're getting is 100 views per video. And your next video, ones after that, you just keep getting 100 views. What's happening a lot of the time is you might be kind of maintaining that 100 people, but what actually is happening is those people that used to kind of believe in you, they start dropping off. They start seeing that you aren't growing, and I don't mean like you're not growing in terms of like you're not growing in subscribers or views or whatever. That's part of it, sure. Some people are, you know, let's say fair weather fans or whatever. But the other thing is that they see that you're not progressing, and so they just start to feel like you're wasting their time. They see that you're just sort of putting out stuff, you're not improving things, or you're not even challenging yourself or even going in that same upward direction that you were first striving for, because you just like are focusing on basically just putting out a video each time, but not even really caring about the quality or making it better. So you might see those 100 viewers and think, oh, I'm not growing. Well, what's actually is happening is you're getting new viewers and they keep falling off. Your old viewers, they used to maybe think you had potential. They used to share the video with their friends and stuff. And then all of a sudden, they're just like, they kind of feel embarrassed because they've showed that video or your channel to somebody. And then you kind of made them look bad. You kind of basically let them down because like now those friends that used to believe in you were like, oh, I guess I wasn't right about this guy, you know? Like, he seemed like he was on the right track, but never mind, like, don't keep focusing on, like, they don't want to stop promoting you because they just basically don't believe in anything that you're trying to do at the moment. Because you, in a sense, just sort of gave in and maintained a certain level of quality without growing. You let those people down, they dropped off. Another thing too is like, it just becomes less exciting. So when people see that you're not even trying to make anything better, they're just like, they're less excited by what you're doing. Like, they used to be kind of like really pumped that you're about to put out something new, because it was like, oh man, this new bit of content, this new this new thing, it was like, I can't wait for the next one. Then all of a sudden, it's just not exciting anymore. It's not novel, you haven't changed it up, you stopped growing, whatever. They're not excited. And like I said, they stop wanting to even share this stuff with anyone else they know because it just makes them look bad. They're like, okay, I don't want to be known as the guy who likes this guy anymore because clearly he's just stuck where he's at. I'm gonna move on to this other person now who has more potential and who might even not even have as much status as you have, but they see that this person has a better trajectory than you are, so they're just like, let's just move on. So, all right, so how other ways to overcome the trap. So I mentioned some of the qualities that you needed to overcome the affirmation trap. So, you know, you need to have self-awareness, you need to have confidence, and you need to have a vision. But here's some other kind of tools, or let's say tricks, whatever you can do to kind of help out a bit with that too. So one, you need to consider the audience you're going to get rather than your current audience. So sometimes you just focus on this fact that like, okay, this video, I only have, you know, 50, 100, whatever people watching it. Why am I going to spend this much time editing it, right? Why would I even put that much work into this stuff? I got other things to do. They don't like to ever consider a future audience. And that's not ideal, because the best case scenario, and this is maybe even applies sometimes to, I've heard this apply to comedy, but I wouldn't say it's exactly the same, but an example with comedy is when you're a stand-up comedian, what you do, even if you're performing, let's say, a stand-up set, again, things have changed since, but I'm gonna use this as an example. If you show up to a venue and there's only 5-10 people, you wanna perform like there's 100 people or 1,000 people in the crowd anyway, generally, right? I mean, you might tailor your content, your bits, your material for those people a bit better, but you don't really want to basically disappoint those people who came out, because that's not ultimately productive. So for the 5, 10, 50 people that are coming out to watch this video, future content of mine, I want it to be as though it's up to par with if there was 1,000 people are going to watch this or more. The idea being that that's ultimately the audience I want to attract. It's the kind of level content I want to put out, so that I can be known for that. But if people don't see that they're getting that audience, they don't usually think about that. So one of the reasons for doing that too is, like, if you put out that kind of level of content, eventually people might come across your channel. They might come across your work. They might see what you've been doing eventually, right? You might get some exposure, and then people will discover you. So once people will discover you, do you want to be that creator, like I said before, who has an audience and then they just start to drop off because they see you're not improving? No, you want people to discover you and be like, wait, I was missing out on this guy's channel, I was missing out on this work, whatever it was. And in that way, they actually have all this stuff they can kind of go through then, right? You have like a whole back catalog of things to look at for people to kind of go through and admire that you did. Think of it as like a TV series that you binge watch on Netflix. You might have only discovered the TV show that you ended up really liking around season 3 or whatever, but then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I have season 1 and season 2 to now binge watch? That's awesome. And those people didn't care that they weren't around for the pilot episode, that they weren't around for your beginning, but they're happy to be where they're at now and to have all of this volume of stuff to now go through. Another thing way to overcome, you know, first one I just said was to like picture the audience you're going to have, but then also just recognize that people do admire and recognize hard work. So if you're actually putting in the time and you're basically working your butt off, trying to innovate, trying to grow, people are going to recognize that. They're going to relate to that. They're going to want to give you exposure. They're going to want to help to push you forward. Because one, they recognize the trajectory you might have, but they might just admire the fuck out of you. Sorry, they might admire you. I don't know why I'm censoring, but whatever. They just want to basically get you some recognition for what you've done. They almost see themselves in you in some way. They feel as though, look, if I did all this stuff, I really wish someone would have showed this if I did that, right? I wish someone would have recognized me for all this work. Here, let's get this guy some attention if I can. Like, I only have a few friends, but here, let's just share this and let's see if they think the same thing I do. So that's one thing people don't necessarily understand, is that people will recognize the effort you're putting in. And that means a lot. So those are 3 things, you know: recognize your future audience, recognize that the work you put out, it'll be like your back catalog, and that also people recognize hard work. So those are 3 tricks to kind of overcome, is that you understand that. It puts it into better perspective. It gives you sort of even a little bit of motivation, knowing that it doesn't matter how you're doing at this moment in time. What matters is moving forward, people see that you're on the right trend. So getting back to some of the traps of affirmation. Once you finally get affirmation, you can start to plateau if you don't remember how you got there in the first place. You basically reach a certain point, and like I said, you might actually have a good traction, you might have a good following by then. But then people just start to lose interest in you, and you don't really kind of understand why. And I wouldn't say this is applicable to most all people who have gotten to a certain place, because some people they do realize what got them to the table in the first place. And maybe if they realize they're losing audience or traction, they kind of go back to that well of what was working. Or they try and, you know, try and get back that, what's it called? They try and get that chemistry back, or whatever it was that got them to the place in the first place. So if you're able to keep things in a good context and understand, like I said, that's where self-awareness comes into play too. Some people can kind of get a lot of traction and success, but they never really were self-aware of how they did it. They just were really good maybe at what they're doing. Maybe they're really motivated, but they didn't really understand what went into it as much as they could have. So eventually they do plateau, and they're almost stuck in that spot. So I did mention that to overcome the affirmation trap, it does help to have growth. It does help to recognize that, you know, improving and going on a better trajectory is a way to basically, you know, get to the point ultimately of success where you get that affirmation. But one thing to note is that there is a certain point where if you're putting out such high quality work, if you are like the #1 person doing it, if you've set such a high bar, such a high standard already, you can afford to, let's say, coast a bit. So if you're already doing way better than anyone else, and no one is even close, or you just have such a niche that you're fulfilling, there is a point where you can just sort of coast. And the reason for that is you're basically at such a high bar, such a high standard, that maybe the actual difficulty at that point is just maintaining it. Because like I said, you can get burnt out, you can kind of lose motivation for different reasons. But sometimes constant growth isn't really maintainable either. So if you really are the #1 person, you have the highest bar, I wouldn't say you don't want to keep looking for ways to improve, because you probably want to maintain that position and that standard. But again, it can just be an area where you can finally realize, okay, now I can just sort of, I can rest a little bit and not work myself to the point of exhaustion or whatever it was that maybe you needed to actually get to that point. Because like I said, once you get affirmation, things do become a little bit easier. You can collaborate with other people, you have more resources. And once you get to that point, you and those other people essentially have it all, you know, available to you, and you're at such a high standard that no one else is really there yet. So you can keep that in mind too, that eventually it's not all about constant growth, but you still should keep in mind that there are ways to improve even once you get to that point. But maintaining that standard that you have is really important, and it can allow you to take a break and coast a bit eventually. Alright, so here's another thing that is related to affirmation, and it's almost a different topic in itself, but not really. So you have the affirmation trap, but then you also have it from your peers. So let's get into that. When you're in an industry and you start, you know, working with people or comparing yourself to people or getting in touch with others, those other people, they'll start to impose their vulnerabilities and their insecurities onto you, either willingly or unwillingly, because basically they might not have that confidence, they might not be self-assured because they don't have the affirmation either. Oh, my battery is low. I'm gonna switch it out. So as I was mentioning, they'll impose the vulnerabilities and insecurities onto you. A lot of times too, when you're in an industry, sometimes people have only been in that industry. They don't have other trades, they haven't done other stuff really. This is their only thing. So, you know, they want to kind of, that's all they know. And what can happen is sometimes you can come into an industry from something else. Like say you were already really competent in one area, one skill set or something. And then once you get into a new industry, you realize, oh, I can apply these same things that I learned into this one. You know, I had to get confidence at first in this one area, but now that I'm into this new trade, I realize, oh, it's not too different from that, right? So that's something that you can recognize, but other people won't really see that. They'll kind of feel like that's not how it is. So another thing that kind of goes along with the reason for why they feel like they're going to impose their, you know, insecurities and stuff onto you is once you get into this industry, they might see any progress or rapid progress that you have. They might see how quickly you're progressing, and basically they'll think that you're doing it in an inappropriate way. So you're going about it too fast, you're jumping up steps, you're not doing it right, because let's say you just jump right into it, you know? You see what the best people are doing and you just try and kind of, you know, follow what they've been doing. And they almost think you're just going a little bit too quick. And they don't really like that. So like sometimes people think that you need to have a certain amount of hours logged, or you need to have a certain amount of experience before you can really get to this level that they think, okay, I'm cool with you being here now. And some industries are really based on time and experience. Like talent and stuff is a factor, but if you're, let's say, in the comedy industry, a lot of comedians, they're not even considered to be veteran comedians until like their 4th, 5th year, whatever into it that they've done it. And it's because it's an industry that basically rewards time and experience, I would say even more than they do talent and other stuff, because they just kind of want to give people their due once they finally put in all this work or this time. So that's one trap that you're going to find with that, is that your peers are going to kind of be self-limiting in certain ways. They'll also see any validation that you're getting, and they'll see it as a threat in some ways to them sometimes, because they aren't getting that validation from people, right? So you jumped into it, and they might kind of discredit the validation you just got, because they just think, they find a reason for why whoever gave it to you either doesn't know what they're talking about or whatever, because they didn't get that validation themselves. Another more sort of devious thing is that the top players in an industry can actually mislead you, and they can kind of instill in you some false beliefs that will hinder your progress. So if someone who's really experienced in the industry, they've kind of seen everyone progress and maybe they haven't or whatever, they'll give you all these reasons and they'll kind of overload you with doubt. They'll overload you and kind of say, here's what you need to do. You need to follow these steps. If you don't follow them, you're not going to be successful. And either willingly or not, sometimes they'll actually sabotage you in that way. Maybe they'll even give you some like 5 reasons or 5 things that you can do to improve. And they're all new to you because you're just in this industry. You're like, okay, fair enough. Try this, try that, try that. And some of it might be relevant, some of it might be helpful. let's say one of them isn't, say one of the 5 isn't, and you decide, okay, I'm not going to do that. Well, then that person, your peer in the industry, they're going to be maybe offended that you didn't take that one bit of advice from them. They see you're not following that one step of theirs because you realize maybe that actually isn't right, he's wrong. And they'll almost kind of want to punish you a bit for some reason. They'll be like, hey, if you just followed my advice, you'd be on the right track right now, but looks like you didn't do what I said, so sorry about that. Like, they'll inadvertently or purposefully kind of do that. So, as I was saying, the top players will pile on some stuff, these questions to you. You know, some of the top players have been in this industry that you just got in. They've been there for like years, and they might overload you with questions. Be like, what about this? What about that? Have you considered this? Have you even thought about that? And they'll instill in you some doubt and whatever. One of the ways to overcome that is to kind of go back to the basis of affirmation in the first place, which is why I was saying you need to have self-confidence, you need to have self-awareness, and you need a vision. And also, what helps is you actually also need to be your own harshest critic. So that's the problem, is sometimes when you get into some industry, you want other people to validate your work, to give you that credibility. But the problem is, if you sometimes take on their criticisms, that's fine, but you should have already been as self-critical about your work to the point where anything they said isn't new, or isn't something you've already thought about and are meaning to kind of improve upon already. So sometimes you're not going to be perfect or, you know, excellent right away, or have this high standard, but you know how to get there. And all this stuff, like you should, if you're your own harshest critic. You're like, okay, I didn't do this video perfectly, or this wasn't edited, whatever, you know, whatever makes it so that you weren't at this highest standard. You know that, and you know next time to improve that. But if you're always asking other people, hey, what can I do to improve, and each time they come back at you with something new, then you probably aren't your own harshest critic. And then once they give you critique, you might be offended by that because you just never held yourself to that high standard. So one way to just avoid any kind of real trouble that comes from not having that kind of validation and affirmation from peers is be self-aware, be self-confident, have a vision, and be your own harshest critic along the way. I mean, don't, like, you know, be upset at yourself, but I'm just saying you want to actually know the flaws in your work before anyone else can even point it out to you, so that once they say it, you're not like surprised by it. And if anything, you even had more critiques that they didn't even recognize, because you actually were already so set on improving them anyway that it wasn't even necessary that they kind of gave it to you. But it was maybe nice to hear that they saw the same thing that you did, but it doesn't shock you the same way, it doesn't offend you the same way that it would if someone just critiqued you out of the blue and you didn't have that awareness that, oh, okay, maybe it wasn't that great. I thought it was amazing, and now I'm offended because you said it wasn't. Like, and the thing is too, if someone gives you critique and it's not valid critique, and you realize that they're just, you know, being way too harsh of a critic, you'll know that too by how much you've critiqued yourself. Because sometimes you see it and you're like, okay, he doesn't realize, or they don't realize how much work it took to even get this, and look what they've done. They don't do anything like what I've done. So who are they to even criticize, not even knowing all that's involved to get to this point? Or even you might even think, you know, like, I've only been at this for a year. Yeah, you can be this critical, but realize I'm getting on the right track. And if you compare myself to other people who have only been at this for a year, I'm actually much more capable, competent than they had been at that point. So trying not to focus too much on that, or at all. And that's kind of one of the ways you can overcome some of these scrutiny and the wrong affirmation from peers. because they'll impose their own belief set onto you. So another thing when it comes to your peers, here's a saying that really I like, that stuck with me. It's that you want respect, you want credibility, right? So this is a line that was thrown out in a rap battle, and it was one other artist who was talking to another artist, right? And he basically said, you know, fuck you. I get respect from the people that you look up to. So that is your goal. You don't want to worry about the peer in your neighborhood, on your street, on your industry, your local industry. You want respect from the people that they respect. Because if you get respect from the people that they respect, ooh, that stings. Ooh. Like, they can't deny all of a sudden someone else seeing potential, someone else appreciating the road you're on, if you're getting respect from the people that they admire. So that is one of your goals when you're trying to overcome affirmation from your peers, is don't focus on your peers. Focus on the people that they admire or they respect, if you really want to prove yourself to them, if that's something you care about even. Say to yourself, I want to get respect from the people that you look up to. It's a great line. So on that same topic, how do you get that respect from the people they look up to? So what you want to do is, you don't want to focus, like I said, on proving yourself to the people next to you. You want to associate and try and get on the radar of people who you look up to that are even in a higher playing field. One thing to note about that is, if people who are really successful see that someone is an up and coming talent, that they're putting in work and they're on the right trajectory, basically the old guard, the old industry talent, they'll want to like bring in the new talent to keep themselves relevant. They, you know, they're at a certain point where maybe they can't keep growing and maintaining, but one thing they can do is, you know, they can recognize someone else who is bringing in this whole new wave of excitement, and they want to latch on to that. So the old guard, to stay relevant, they'll bring in new talent. That's one thing that is important to them too, because they want to sustain where they're at, and sometimes new talent can help kind of reinvigorate them as well. Yeah. Another thing too is, if you're just, you know, you're still kind of concerned on how well you're doing, try and like field test your work with the crowd who just doesn't have any vested interest in what you've done. Battery's dying again. Check in with you in a second. So if you do want some sort of unbiased feedback, you can always just test out what you've done with some people who just, you know, they don't have a vested interest in if you succeed or not. So your peers, they might have some interest that you're not aware of, and they might not give you the right feedback, or whoever. So sometimes a complete, you know, sample group of people who just don't have that vested interest will actually give you the most honest and true opinions of how you're actually doing. One note on that is that when you are putting out stuff and you want to kind of test to see how people respond to it, you want to use that testing stuff as feedback and reassurance in some ways, but you don't want it to actually lead what you're doing. So you should always lead your content. You only use testing to kind of reaffirm things that you already know, or to test something new that you weren't quite sure of. But you don't want it to actually test, you don't want to get feedback from your audience and let that lead your next decision or your next move. That's something that you should always be sort of the one doing, because you should have the best understanding of the direction that you need to go. So this sort of ends my topic on affirmation. I do have Another little point I might add to this, but aside from that, realize why it's a trap. Realize all the things that are involved with affirmation, how to overcome it, and who will be influencing you in terms of your peers in your industry. And try and use these tricks, all that sort of stuff, to kind of put it in the right perspective. And with that, you'll kind of be able to get out of the affirmation trap. Because like I said, affirmation, it's a long way away. You won't get affirmation until you've convinced individuals, until you've convinced the groups that convince those individuals, until you convince the whole industry, and then convince the whole world. That's when you finally get it. So it's a long way away. You'll get there, but it comes out to credibility and validation and everything else. All right, see you guys later.